It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, we are live. This is Councilmember Jay Schenirer. I'm here with Michael Jasso, who's our Assistant City Manager over Economic Development. Welcome everyone to our weekly show. And if I can just go for a few minutes about what we did last night. We had about a 6.5-hour council meeting. We spent 2.5 hours talking about building a sobriety center. We know we have a huge problem with methamphetamines. And so what we really need to do there is provide more service. And Councilmember Jeff Harris has been working very hard for the last year or so to figure out how we could do that in partnership with the county and other entities. And so we talked a lot about that. We also had folks from our police department come and talk about recommendations. First, that came from the Department of Justice, and then also from our police commission. And that will be all posted for transparency on the city's website if you want to see what the recommendations were by both the police commission and the DOJ and how our department has responded to that. And then finally, we spent quite a bit of time with the Black Child Legacy campaign and their Healing the Hood initiative. We have had, as many of you know, a tremendous amount of gang violence over the last few months. And where we went 2 years without a youth homicide, we have unfortunately broken that streak as well. So what the council did was direct city manager to work out about $2 million, $750,000 from an anti-gang task force account that we had, and another $1.25 million from CARES money, our federal stimulus money. Those funds, hopefully within the next few weeks, will be going to a number of organizations, including Brothers to Brothers, through Sierra Health Foundation and others, to really get after the gang problem that we have. So we're excited about that and getting some positive results with our young people. So I'm here, as I said, with Michael Jasso, who has been with the city for a year.
Little over 2 years now. It's hard to believe.
Time flies. And so, as we always do, I want to ask Michael to give a 2 to 3 minute bio of himself, just so we know where he is and where he's come from and why he's here.
Sure. Well, appreciate it. Thank you very much, Jay. Appreciate the opportunity to be on, and appreciate the opportunity to speak with you to our community. About me, I'm a native Chicagoan. I grew up on the southwest side of Chicago in a neighborhood that's called Back of the Yards. And it's called Back of the Yards because it was the other side of the stockyards. Some of you that are familiar with the work of Upton Sinclair and know the jungle will know the Back of the Yards, because that's exactly the neighborhood I grew up in, which historically was heavily Polish and Lithuanian, but today is almost like a lot of our communities is populated mainly Hispanic, mainly Mexican American. And so I'm the son of my father immigrated from Mexico City in his 20s, and he met my mom in Chicago, so kind of got married there. My mom is of Mexican ancestry, but was born in Chicago. So that having been said, grew up very much in the city, in a dense urban environment. In many ways knew the city and how to get around the city very early on, before I knew a lot of things. So went to high school in the Chicago area, but then attended Princeton for my undergraduate, where I received a degree in architecture. And I always loved buildings and cities and how they work. I was fortunate that my father was great in taking us around and really showing us the city. He actually worked shifts that didn't make him available during the day, but it gave us exposure on the weekends to really exploring the city. So I received an undergraduate degree in architecture. I have an MBA from the University of Texas at Austin. I served, probably one of the more interesting things about me, I served for 2 years as a Peace Corps volunteer, working as a preservation architect in Sana'a, Yemen, which is a very tortured place these days, unfortunately, on a World Heritage Site. So working on the preservation of the old city of Sana'a. Post that, I came back to Chicago, worked for a not-for-profit, which was funded by the Lilly Endowment, but it was also part of the National Trust for Historic Preservations. Went and got my MBA at the University of Texas at Austin, and then worked back and forth between Chicago and DC in economic development and real estate development, both on the public and the private side. I worked for Arthur Andersen, working on large infrastructure projects, mainly in Latin America. Probably a lot of your viewers are too young to even remember who Arthur Andersen was, or with respect to it, but large consulting firm. And then I worked for the District of Columbia, heading up their economic development finance. So projects I worked on there were things like Gallery Place or Nationals Baseball Stadium, or the redevelopment of Columbia Heights, which is the most diverse community in the District of Columbia. Went back to Chicago, working 2 different stints for the city of Chicago in Department of Planning and Development, and ultimately left as the managing deputy commissioner for the Bureau of Economic Development at the city of Chicago. So overseeing all the large central district projects and lots of other things in the city of Chicago. And then went to work for the county. So, and that was a unique experience for me, learning the difference between kind of the city and the county in my mind. And actually, I find Sacramento similar at that time. A lot of people didn't know what counties do. So I think one of the things I bring to the table now is I do know what counties do and can't do, and their relationship to the city a little bit better to appreciate the dynamic situation that we have here in Sacramento. But about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago, was afforded this opportunity. And Sacramento is really attractive on a lot of fronts. It's a city, it's that right size city of 500,000 people in the city, 2 million in the metro area, to really move things and change. And secondly, it was a city in major transition, both because of happenstance, just happens to be the capital of California, the most dynamic economy in the country and one of the most dynamic and significant economies in the world, and deliberate direction of the mayor, the council, in terms of trying to see what is the role of the city in a larger growing metropolitan area, and the ability to try to get things right, whether it's looking at equity and inclusion and how do we make sure that as we grow our cities, reinvigorate and invest in our cities, and it really does bring everyone along and not just certain parts of the population. So given the discussions I had with the mayor and the city manager and the opportunity to work with council, I thought it was and it's been a great move. I do have some family in the area. My brother and his family long ago, 30 years ago, settled in the Bay Area. He lives in San Francisco with his wife and my 2 nephews. So it wasn't a complete disconnection, but excited to be here in Sacramento.
Well, we're excited. Thank you for going through that. I'm not sure why I'm reverberating there, but hopefully our folks can fix that. And I don't know, have we talked about you being a Longhorn before?
Only briefly, because I know you went to LBJ.
Right.
UT was a great place. It was such a different world from Princeton. First of all, I do bemoan the fact that both my schools have bad colors, or at least in my mind, bad colors. So I went from orange and black to burnt orange and black. But it was a great experience to be. And Austin's an amazing city, and in some ways, Sacramento reminds me of Austin when I was there in '93, '94, in the sense of capital cities, major states, transitioning economies, about the same size, and kind of what that future may look like. My years at Austin, '93, '94, was the very first year of South by Southwest. Mm-hmm. So I kind of remember South by Southwest as a quaint music festival in a great music city, and it's obviously something much more significant now. But
not a place you want to be today, but definitely. It's got the heat. I have 2 of my kids are here from Austin for a couple of months. They don't want to go back between COVID and the humidity. I think that's what
it does have the heat. And that's exactly right. It's people don't appreciate that even though it's lower humidity than Houston, when you're 105 degrees, it doesn't take that much humidity to really feel it.
Right. No, it's a great city, and we hope they're doing well. So let's talk about the direction that the city has tried to take around economic development. We throw around the term inclusive economic development. Can you maybe start out, Michael, by telling us how do you define that, and what do you think are the goals that we have over the next few years here? Let's start with the big picture.
Sure. Well, first and foremost, it's by definition making sure that as we think about what are the opportunities to grow and enhance our city, we're really fundamentally starting from a way that looks at what does it mean to all our communities, and particularly those historically disinvested communities that will in fact define the future of the city, because we are a changing city in terms of demographics, and we need to make sure that as we're thinking about growth strategies for the city, it's not what is the traditional way of looking at economic development, which is we grow our economy and we, as an afterthought, think about how do we bring other communities into that economy. And very often, sometimes that takes, the most simplistic way of looking at it is that what our most challenged neighborhoods need are addressing food deserts, et cetera. How do we, and those are important quality of life measures in terms of how we invest in our communities, but those don't fundamentally transition into opportunity, wealth building, and employment. So being very deliberate about targeted strategies of what are those sectors of our economy that we're uniquely positioned to take advantage of. So what are Sacramento's assets? How do we build those in a way that everyone participates? So as we're thinking about life sciences, it's not just about building off of the big life science, which we have a tremendous asset here in the form of UC Davis and other things that are growing up around it, but how do we encourage entrepreneurship, job creation, opportunities that are relevant to those communities that immediately surround it and our broader communities, so that it's not just an influence, right? One of the things I think we could all say, let's say 10 years from now, Aggie Square truly succeeds and it was really an enclave of life and biomedical sciences housed here in our city, but it was all made possible because we imported talent from outside the area, and that's who's really benefited. I don't think many of us that look at inclusive and equitable investment and development would say that's a win for us, right? I think that really is not the scenario. So we have to be very cognizant as we grow our economy to ensure that it's strategies that are built around our residents, that is informed by our residents, and that our residents participate from day one in creating that strategy.
So that's great. If we're thinking about the corridors, maybe we could talk a little bit for my district, District 5, certainly Stockton Boulevard, which you've mentioned, which I share with Eric Guerra. We have a lot of initiatives going on there. Franklin Boulevard is another one. And Franklin Boulevard, I think, through their PBID, has been a great example of a business community and a community saying, we want to change who we are and what we're doing and really update it. They wrote their own strategic plan. They have been very, very aggressive about going out and getting grants. So if you were acting kind of, and I know you've done this before, if you were acting in your role as a consultant, and you were meeting with the folks at Franklin Boulevard or the next Franklin Boulevard, what would you be telling them that they should be doing now and thinking about to really make a change in their own business climate?
Sure. So it's a couple of things. I guess first of all is, and this is important about them, Franklin Corridor or the PBID having done its own assessment, is I think first you need to understand what you're starting. What are the fundamental assets that are there in terms of the businesses, in terms of literally physical opportunity, et cetera, in terms of development opportunities, the businesses that are there. That's number one. Two is, who are the natural partners, right? So at the end of the day, government can't own a vision more than the community should, right? It needs to be built from the community in the sense of what do we want to see happen there. Three is appreciating the world is changing, right? So commercial corridors and the challenges of commercial corridors and keeping them active and vibrant is not something unique to Sacramento. It's happening all over the country, all over the world, due to the changing nature of retailing, due to the changing nature of work, et cetera. And so what does that corridor, which is a great thoroughfare, right? You have people that transit it, and transit becomes very important in the discussion. How do people get to the corridor? How do people stay there? How do they move from the corridor to other parts of the city, outside of the city? How do you leverage that? And what are the things you need to happen? So partners, I often say it's really tough to talk about economic development without simultaneously talking about transit, because they are one and the same in terms of the discussion. But that's the first piece, just self-assessment of where we are there. Two is, are there unique opportunities to build on, right? You don't necessarily need to have an Aggie Square in your backyard to build on energies. But if you are a connection to that point, that's a tremendous synergy. How do you build on that and begin to differentiate? Two is, I think we are also fundamentally rethinking corridors in the sense of they're no longer going to be places just of commerce. They're places of residence too. So one of the things we are actively doing is going around our corridors, doing the strategic planning that we need to, trying to make the corridors, any development as we move forward, look as by right as possible in the context of Sacramento, in the context of California, because California is a relatively tough development environment, tough compared to the rest of the country and particularly other places, because one of the things we increasingly appreciate in economic development, right, is that cities don't compete against each other. Regions compete against each other. And by that same analogy, Stockton doesn't have an economy. The Stockton corridor doesn't have an economy unto its own. It's part of a larger economy, and we have to understand that placement in that larger economy. And then three, build across local assets. There's a lot about place-based building, and a lot of neighborhood building is based on the fact that Stockton, Franklin have the potential to be destinations unto themselves. So how do you position them physically? How do you market them to the city? No one should love Stockton or Franklin more than the city itself, right? That's that. And how do we create that love affair with a corridor like a Franklin, so that everyone, if I lived in Natomas or another part of the city, or lived in Roseville, would think this is a great place to be, to do commerce, to visit, because it's a real asset. So starting from that framework of assess what do you have, assess, what are the unique opportunities in the context of a larger economy. Don't try to separate yourself and say, we're going to be this, even though this is not what Sacramento is about, and then act on those. I am a believer that a couple of key investments can be huge in turning a tide and making trends happen. There's a cliche in development, Jay, that you're probably familiar with, is nothing brings development like development. And how do we look at those catalytic things that can be invested in early that will help sustain the momentum that you want to build? That's a virtuous cycle.
So maybe, Michael, also, if you could talk a little bit about, excuse me, what you see the city needs as infrastructure to make this happen. I mean, when you started here, and I've been on the council almost 10 years now, I think we were down to about 7 people in our economic development department from a high of maybe 22 or 24 folks. I know we've invested some funds in that in our last budget, but what do we need to do to be able to play the role of, I think, catalyst alongside sitting at the table with the folks from Franklin Boulevard? And we did have a question, and I know that, again, they've been a model of participation, both on the community side and on the business side. They've really done quite a bit. And as I said, they've applied for a lot of grants. They do have a complete street grant coming. They've had one, they'll have more as they go forward. But what does the city have to do to really muscle up to play that role?
Well, the first thing I would do is say thank you to you and your colleagues and the mayor in terms of realizing that one of the things we needed in economic development and planning were the resources of people and support of those people. Because
okay, go ahead and say thank you. That's fine. We appreciate
it. Thank you. So because the reality is that tools are great, and one of the challenges we have here in California, and in my view as an outsider, and I think I can still say that as an outsider, the dissolution of redevelopment was problematic. I appreciate that it may have required fixing at the time, but the idea that the tool itself, or a tool that allows for wholesale change of areas from their infrastructure perspective, physical infrastructure perspective, wasn't needed anymore, I think is a mistake. And I think we're challenged now trying to figure out how to fill that through other resources, through other kinds of thinking about it. So it's not just about the regulatory environment, which we're also trying to shape and streamline so it's more possible to do development. But you can have lots of money, but if you don't have the resources of people and technical experience to help communities figure out how to best utilize that money, how to actually take their aspirations and make them a reality, they're useless. So for instance, one of the things having dealt a lot with redevelopment or tax increment finance, I often got questioned in Chicago saying, hey, do I think this has really failed, this redevelopment area? I said, more often it's not so much that I see a lot of bad projects, I see a lot of promises unfulfilled because there weren't the resources to actually execute on the promise. So having people in economic development, one of the things we were cognizant about, we're bringing good staff members and also creating community engagement group, both within economic development and community development. 2, as a city, break down barriers. when I first came to Sacramento, my observation is, as a city, I think we're pretty collegial. By city, I mean city departments, I think we get along, we work pretty well. I would also say historically, or at least from what I've seen, we've tended to be fairly siloed. And the reality is that everything, I always say this, everything the city does is economic development. How we police, how we invest in infrastructure, how we can ultimately is economic development, because it creates economic opportunity if you do it right, or it stifles economic opportunity if you don't do it or don't do it well. So that's another piece, that we're there. And then finally, tools are important. And one of the things we are trying to figure out, and I applaud Council's leadership in passing Measure U, because clearly one of the intents of Measure U was to create resources. We're going to be challenged for a while, but hopefully not indefinitely on how to replace those resources. But also thinking about using other tools, whether it's enhanced infrastructure districts that we're looking at across the city, because we do know we have a lot of we're an older city. We have older corridors. One of the things we want to do is encourage density, right? Bring more people living in the city, working in the city, conducting commerce in the city. And we know we have a lot of infill infrastructure needs. And the final piece here as a city is we have to advocate. No city does it alone in any given state, right? We're never going to be an island of prosperity and equity and inclusivity if the state of California isn't moving in a similar direction. It's just too much a challenge. So the state needs to be a critical partner. I would contend the feds need to be as well. I'm not necessarily kind of that confident right now. Hopefully at some point in the future we can be more reliant on the leadership at a federal level, but at least for right now, the city and the state need to be online. And I think there is a lot of, and this is where I said we're past happenstance. I think there is a lot of deliberate intent in California, and certainly in the city of Sacramento, to lead the city in a pathway that really, I think, speaks to the future of the city. And it'll be interesting to see. I think we're probably going to be on the upside once we get past the pandemic, because I think there's going to be a lot of interest. There already was interest in Sacramento, right? We were the fastest growing city in California. I think that's only going to accelerate for mid-sized cities like Sacramento.
Right. Are there cities that we look at that have gone through this? I mean, we're not unique. Obviously, we want to do it the Sacramento way. But where else in the country have they done a good job that we could look at and say, that's kind of a path that we'd like to be on?
Well, it depends on different topics. So different cities, could be great in one area. For instance, commercial corridor revitalization. Portland has certainly done a lot in that area. Minneapolis has done a lot in terms of neighborhood and commercial revitalization. We know that Minneapolis is challenged in other areas, that are important about equity and inclusiveness. So there are definitely some good examples out there. Some of them are highly localized, right? There are specific tools at play here, but and I think I would say this is, for instance, because one of the things, there's also cities that we don't necessarily want to emulate, right? In the sense of we are part of the larger Bay economy.
You can just use their initials. It's okay.
Well, I'll speak to the Bay as an example, which is, right, we are part of the larger Bay economy. And that's a plus and a negative. Plus is we're part of that economy, everything it implies about being a dynamic kind of part of the world or the economy. But it is also it's also an economy that has tended to exacerbate marginalized communities kind of even more than lots of places, because of the loss of those mid-tier, whether it's manufacturing, other kind of jobs that are available to a broader population. So we don't necessarily we want to partake in that part of that economy, but we don't necessarily want the same results, which has basically been huge amounts of gentrification come in the city. So, and I think we can avoid that. I truly do believe we can avoid that. But the best way to avoid that is be conscious of it now as we grow those opportunities. So there's lots of exciting things. The nice thing about the mid-sized cities is there's lots of examples, a lot of things going on in Indiana. I think we were on the trip to Indianapolis together, right? There was a lot to learn in Indianapolis, particularly a supportive institutions. But that having been said, we're not going to be in Indianapolis, nor do we want to be. There's lots of things that are problematic in Indianapolis, as an example. Chicago has tremendous kind of things going on, some of the larger cities, but there's also lots of challenges that we don't want to emulate. So we do pay attention to that. We actually, for instance, right now going through the COVID crisis, one of the things that I do every Monday is I participate in a national call that has a lot of the economic development people from Austin, from Atlanta, from New York, from Chicago, from San Francisco, San Jose, San Diego, and we talk about how we're addressing COVID and CARES, and a lot of times we're learning, but I will also say a lot of times we're leading in terms of where we're going. We were actually very much ahead of the curve on how we were thinking about using the CARES dollars kind of nationally. And we shouldn't be shy about leading, but we also shouldn't be shy. I always said, like, I'm the first person to steal a good idea.
Yeah.
Right? There's no reason to recreate the wheel.
Yeah, we've got a question from someone in Lamb Park who's watching through one of the PBIDs, I believe, or neighborhood organizations around technology and how that figures into economic development. And I know Maria McGonigal, our information technology person, is doing a great job, but maybe you could address that a little bit.
Yeah, and really, she is. And one of the things we're looking at, for instance, on technology is how do we, so expansion of broadband is not a new topic, but it's taking on an increased urgency because today we need that infrastructure in place. So one of the questions is one, are there a lot of other ways to think about broadband now? I know, and it's fine to experiment. We're doing the RT buses with broadband, in our communities to try to extend that. And while I wouldn't necessarily say it's a perfect success, we're learning a lot about how do we extend that? How do we do various things that we're doing? And Maria was great, and one of the things doing is extending our partnership of thinking about out of the box, not usual partners, right? So Maria is working and reaching out to United Way and other community partners to figure out how do we leverage those that are already in the community, that this may not have been their normal business line, right? I don't think they were necessarily thinking about we're in the broadband business, but maybe the broadband business is where you need to be to address some of these other issues. So the thing I always encourage from all staff that whether internal economic development is start with the problem statement first. Don't get bogged down by what your title is and what that implies about the work you do. Start with the problem statement. Where does that lead you in terms of connectivity? And don't be afraid to explore that.
No, that's great. And I know that we've put, I believe, 1.5 million in CARES money into both redoing devices that we can hand out and then the connectivity part. Obviously, we're going to have to work with our school districts over time since none of them will be in person and they're all going virtual to make sure that the digital divide doesn't get wider, but that this is an opportunity that we can actually seize upon to close the digital divide and make sure that devices and connectivity are out there in the neighborhoods. So, Michael, the last question I have for you, it's the really easy one. If we could change places here and you were the city council person and you knew you had 4 other votes to do something, what would that be, or what would those things be immediately?
Sure. So I jokingly said for those on the meeting that I would probably first push for fewer council meetings. Only half joking, but honestly, I think one of the things that I would like to see happen, I think there's a role for this. So we started, for instance, I think the city did the wise move by bringing on a chief inclusivity and equity officer for the city with a capital C. I think that's great, but I think one of the things we need to do is look at everything we do through that lens. And that's not to say it's determinative, right? But for instance, but it is informative as to how we think about investments in infrastructure, how we think about investments in facilities. It's problematic when I look at certain areas of the city that have substantially substandard infrastructure compared to other areas of the city. And we need to think about how do we begin to address those inequities on a macro level. And I think kind of putting a lens or paradigm that begins to help us think that way. At a minimum, we should be aware of what is the impact of our decisions or not making decisions on various communities. It's tough to, and I believe once you're aware and kind of see that by definition will begin to inform policymakers of saying, hey, I wasn't quite clear that this is what we're doing. And that's not right. We really need to be thinking about that. It's not going to make a change overnight, but I will assure you that over the real time of cities, the life of cities, which is half a generation as we think about changes, it will make a transformative change to the city. And I think the city is exactly that size, leadership, location to really become an example, not just the United States, but a good part of the world about what does the future of a vibrant, equitable, and inclusive place like Sacramento look in the future.
No, I appreciate that very much. And we haven't used the word equity a lot over the last half an hour, but everything we're doing is really about equity and looking at that lens, particularly when we look at our more at-risk neighborhoods and what they need to be successful. And I know that's the work that you're engaged in, and I think that's why you came here, to be able to engage in that work, and hopefully we'll all be successful together. So let me say thanks very much for joining me this week. We really appreciate it, and you got a lot of work in front of you, and with or without COVID, it was a lot of work. With COVID, it's a tremendous amount of work, but together we're going to get there.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for your leadership on the council and in the community.
Appreciate it. Take good care. We'll
Thanks,
be signing off now. Next week, Nia Weathersmore, who is with Youth Forward, will be coming to talk to us about how we're supporting our young people. Have a good day.